Welcome to chapter 25, which is the digestive system. And I started out with this because I have grandkids, and all of them would tell me, well, my stomach is full for all of that food, but I still have room for dessert, and I still have room for snacks. But the part of my stomach that has like the dinner or breakfast or lunch is already full. So I just wanted you to know that in kids, their stomach has subdivisions, kind of like a cow, at least according to them. So we're going to be talking about catabolic or breakdown processes. So how do you take a Snickers bar and turn it into ATP? So we're going to talk about that process of conversion. So it is a disassembly line, and you have mechanical digestion where you're chewing things, and you have enzymatic digestion where you're breaking things down using enzymes to pull the molecules apart. The whole process of talking about the digestive system is gastroenterology. So that's the study of the digestive tract and all the disorders and weird things that can go on. And we are finding out amazing new stuff about gastroenterology. You know, you think, well, it's your throat and your stomach and your anus, so you're like, what could be so difficult to understand? Well, we found out that the GI tract has its own nervous system. So that was kind of surprising. And we have recently found out that if you bypass the stomach and go into the small intestines, you can cause it to make hormones that actually cure diabetes. So we're just discovering all kinds of new things. So this introductory slide gives you an overview of all the different kinds of things we'll be talking about. Not just mechanical and chemical digestion, but which things are broken down, where, which chemical processes occur, and then accessory organs, things that you don't think about. You know, most people, when you talk about the digestive tract, they just think about the stomach, but they don't think about all the other organs that we have. And the peritoneum, the lining inside the abdomen, this is going to be important. One of the things that we just recently discovered is the mesenteries. They just thought that they were just kind of like something that was there to hold your GI tract in place, your gastrointestinal tract in place. And come to find out, it's an organ of its own, and it has its own things that it does. So like I said, we're constantly learning new stuff about the GI tract. And then we're going to lightly touch on how the nerves impact digestion and chemical controls, hormonal controls. Here are the 5 words that they want you to memorize, although they left out the 6th one, which I think is more fun. Ingestion is taking food into your mouth. Digestion is breaking it down into a form that you can absorb. Absorption, this mostly takes place in the small intestines. And then compaction, this mostly happens in the large intestines and the rectum, and this is where you pull the water out. So up until you get into the last part of the digestive tract, you have kind of a wet mass, which allows the nutrients to be absorbed by the small intestines. But you don't want to pass all of that out. So anyone who's had diarrhea knows what I'm talking about. And I'm going to go off on a little tangent right now because you guys know that I do that a lot. One of the things that will make somebody really angry that has diarrhea is to tell them that they don't have diarrhea. And so they're sitting there going, I have pooped 7 times. And then the person will say, well, was it watery or was there substance to it? And you say, well, yeah, there was some substance to it. Well, then it's not considered diarrhea. So anyway, depending on who you talk to, depending on how much water and how much material there is still remaining in the fluid that's exiting your body determines whether or not you're allowed to call it diarrhea or whether you just have loose stools. And then defecation is actually pooping. So that's the word that you would use. But the word that they left out is right here. It should be right here, mastication. So you have to say it carefully so that people don't misunderstand what you're saying. Mastication is chewing your food. It's the mechanical digestion. Besides grinding your food with your teeth, which is considered mechanical digestion, the churning action of your stomach. So if you've ever been to the doctor and they're listening to your heart, and then they go down and they're listening to your like around your belly button, you're like, what are you doing down there? They're listening to the food, the movement of food in your GI tract. So it literally makes a noise. And as you're churning and moving, the reason you're doing it is, of course, you want to get more of the food up against the walls of the intestine so it can be absorbed. Also, you want the digestive enzymes to be able to get to all the different particles of food that you spent so much time chewing. Most of the catabolic reactions that you're going to have, most of the breaking down processes that you're going to do involve adding a molecule of water. So if you add a molecule of water, you can put an OH group on one of the pieces and an H on the other. So H2O is water. So using water to break apart molecules is how we do most of the catabolic reactions. So you're going to take complex carbohydrates and break them down into polysaccharides. You're going to break them down into monosaccharides. You're going to take proteins and break them down into their individual amino acids so that you can reassemble them into other proteins. You're going to take fats and break them down into smaller fats and fatty acids. And then nucleic acids you can break down into nucleotides, and you can reassemble those into different forms of RNA or different forms of DNA, depending on which nucleotides you have. So just like amino acids make up proteins, you have 20 amino acids, you have 4 nucleotides, 5 if you're looking at RNA. So you have the A, C, T, and G, and you can reassemble them to make different DNA. Or if you throw in uracil, you can make RNA. Some nutrients that you eat are ready to go. So you don't have to break them down, you don't have to change them, they just come right out. So a lot of your vitamins, any amino acids you take in are already in the amino acid form, so you don't have to break them down anymore, and you can just absorb them directly. Minerals, you have copper and iron, zinc, selenium. So there's a lot of minerals and metals that your body needs. Cholesterol, it's ready to rock and roll. It just goes right on in there. And hopefully you remember from the other talks that we've had, cholesterol is not a bad guy. You have to have cholesterol. Cholesterol is a good guy. But anything in excess is not good. So cholesterol is getting a bad rap because people eat too much cholesterol. And then, of course, you've got to have water. You can't digest without water. This has always been an amazing picture to me. It's stuck in my mind. This is your GI tract. So we're going to start out. Here's your mouth. There's your esophagus coming down. There's your stomach. And then you're going to come out of the stomach. There is your pancreas. Then you're going to go into the small intestines. You have a lot of small intestines. Then you get into your large intestines. And there's your appendix sticking off where the small and large intestines join. Looks like a thumb sticking out there. And then there's your large intestines. There's your rectum, which is the holding chamber. And then there's your anus. So these are 5-foot loops. And if you count, they are 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 loops. So your GI tract is about 35 feet long. So basically, it's a tube within a tube. So if your body is like a tube, then this is a tube separate from the body. If you look, something that goes in the mouth does not leave until it exits the rectum. So the only way that you can get anything out of this is to break it up into small enough particles that as it moves through the small intestines, you can absorb it into the body. Now, some books say you have 30 feet. This one showing this shows 35 feet. And the reason for that is this is very stretchy. If you think about it, your stomach can stretch when you eat a meal and then shrink down. And your intestines can certainly expand and stretch as the bolus of food moves through. So anywhere from 30 to 35 feet. And then, of course, if you're looking at somebody who's 6'4" versus somebody who's like 5'2", it's going to vary in those people too. But rule of thumb, however tall you are, multiply that by 7, and that's how many feet you have for your GI tract. So I just showed you your digestive tract or your alimentary canal. Some people call it the alimentary canal. And your book says 30 feet. So again, we know why it varies from book to book. Mouth, throat, there's the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. And the GI tract, when they're just talking about just the GI tract, they're just talking about the stomach and the intestines. So they're not talking about your esophagus or your mouth or any of that part. This is interesting because whenever you go in for an upper GI, then they go in and they look at your mouth, throat, esophagus, and down to your stomach. And if they do a lower GI, then they go up through the anus and up through the rectum and into the large intestines. You've probably heard of people getting a colonoscopy. So that's where they're going. That's the lower GI. Your accessory organs that are considered to be part of the gastrointestinal tract. There's your teeth, your tongue, your salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Now, some of these are included in others, like the pancreas is also in the endocrine system, the salivary glands. The liver, this one's in several because it detoxifies, it helps us make blood, helps break down blood, helps clean the blood. So some of these are in other systems also, but they're added, they're accessories, they're helping the GI tract. One of the things that I always do in lab is I make all of my students stand up and put their hand on their stomach. And 99.9% of the time, the students will put their hand just above their belly button. Well, if you look at this picture, that's not where your stomach is. Here's your belly button in this vicinity, and this is your intestines. So most people don't actually realize their stomach is way over here. It's more on the upper left side, right there. So this guy's flipped over. So you're looking at this thing, well, no, that's the right side. Well, no, you're looking at him face on. So flip him over, and then you'll see that it's on the left side. So that's always a surprise to people to find out that their stomach is not where they think it is. And so now you have to rethink. Oh, my stomach is growling. No, that's not your stomach growling. That's food and gas moving around in your intestines, and you can hear it bubbling. And what's really cool, you won't have this on the test, but it's just one of those things if you're hanging out in a bar and you want to look like you're really, really smart, you can say, do you know the word for food moving through your intestines is borborygmi? So that's one of those words that sounds like the sound that it makes. Borborygmi. So while we're talking about interesting things, here is your ascending colon. So we take the large intestines and we divide it up into the ascending colon, the transverse colon that goes across, and then the descending colon, and then you end up with the rectum, and you can see that this can stretch quite a bit. And then you have the anus, which is basically a really tight sphincter to keep you from having fecal material running out of your body. As you know, I get off track from time to time, but here's something that I found really interesting. When women are in their menstrual cycle, assuming they don't have endometriosis or something like that, the ones who have painful menstrual cramps, your intestines slow down during your menstrual cycle when you're actually menstruating. And you'll find that gases build up and they get trapped right here. See how easy it is? There's a fold here and a fold there. So you can just kind of see how gases could get trapped right there. So a lot of times when a woman has menstrual cramps, it's just trapped gas because of the slowed down motility of the GI tract. So to see if that's actually what the problem is, you can actually just press in this area and see if it hurts. If you press on this side or press on this side, and if you have a shooting pain that goes across there. So what do you do to stop menstrual cramps if it happens to be from the trapped gas in your transverse colon? You can take like Tylenol and aspirin together to stop the pain, or you can lay down on your left side and it should allow the gases to move on out. So, interesting factoid there. Let's see, what else is interesting? Okay, the appendix, they think in the past the appendix used to have an enzyme that could break down fiber. But now we can't break down fiber. We do not have that ability. So whether or not that's true, about the only thing it seems the appendix is good for is to get inflamed, and then you have to have your appendix out. And the number one thing that they find in the appendix that causes appendicitis is toothbrush bristles. So they're not digestible. Used to, toothbrushes were made out of something that was biodegradable. But now they're made out of plastic, and of course you can't digest those. So as it tries to pass through the intestines, the toothbrush bristle that broke off of your toothbrush will lodge in the appendix, and then it just jabs and jabs and jabs and jabs and keeps an inflammation going, an infection going, until you eventually have appendicitis and have to have your appendix removed. So take-home message there. Change your toothbrush, especially if the bristles are all frayed and sticking out every which way. So if your toothbrush looks like this, start out looking like that, ended up looking like that, it's time to switch your toothbrush. Your digestive tract is open to the environment at both ends. And as I said, the material that you eat, unless you can break it down small enough that it can be absorbed, it actually never enters the body. It just passes through. Now, one of the interesting things, again, I love weird facts. The people who have control over their body, these yogis, you see them and they sit and they are looking inward to their insides. They can actually slow their heartbeat down and where you actually think that they're dead. It's so slow. But the other cool thing that they can do is they can reverse peristalsis. So we're going to learn about peristalsis. But most of the things that you put in your body, you put in your mouth and you swallow them, and they go downward until they eventually exit your body. But a yogi can sit in a tub of water and reverse peristalsis and drink the water through their anus. Now, why you would want to do this, I don't know, but they can do it. The other thing that is interesting or important to know, for people who are vomiting and they can't hold down food and they can't hold down medicines, some of the medicines can be administered through the anus, and then it can be absorbed out of the rectum. So that's one of the ways you can deliver medicine, especially for people who are vomiting or can't hold down food. In various places throughout the GI tract, you're going to have different kinds of cells. And in those accessory organs, obviously, you're going to have very different kinds of cells. But overall, that tube that we looked at has a mucosal layer, a muscular layer, and a serosal layer. So the serosal layer has areolar tissue. And if you remember back when we were doing tissues, we talked about areolar tissue. It has mast cells, and if you irritate it, it's going to release histamine. And anytime you release histamine, water, fluid will rush into the area. So if you irritate the serosal area, you're going to have swelling and fluid. The muscularis, you've got an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. And this does a lot better if I can show you with my hands, but you're going to have to use your imagination for this. All right, so your inner circular layer is going to squeeze because it's in a circle. And the easiest way for me to tell you about that is to hand you a tube of toothpaste and have you squeeze it in the middle. And you see the toothpaste comes out the top and then it goes down and causes the bottom to bulge. So I'm sure everybody has squeezed their toothpaste out of the toothpaste tube from the middle. And so you end up with like a figure eight or a dumbbell shape with it cinched in the middle. So that's what your circular layer of muscle does. But if you think about that, if you're trying to squeeze the esophagus, or if you're trying to squeeze the stomach or squeeze the intestines, you don't want the food to go up and to go down. In the case, unless you're a yogi drinking water through your anus, you want the food to go downward. So on the outside of that circular layer, you have a longitudinal layer going up and down. So when you squeeze the inner layer, the longitudinal layer will ripple and push downward. So it's kind of a neat little two-step there. Squeeze, and then the rippling of the longitudinal pushing downward. And then you squeeze and the longitudinal pushes downward. And so you direct the flow of the food downward. So that's why you have two different layers of muscle there. And the mucosa and submucosa, you have the lining of the intestines, the lining of the throat, the lining of the stomach, and you're going to have different kinds of epithelium. So we'll talk about that as we go through. But mucosa, whenever you see the word mucosa, you think mucus. So you're going to have goblet cells. You're going to have slimy stuff. And this is good because the slimy stuff helps your food slide through so it doesn't get stuck. And it also protects you from the stomach acid. So we're going to talk a little bit more about mucosa as we go along. In places in the GI tract where you're going to have a lot of friction, you're going to have stratified squamous epithelium, just like on the outside of your body, so that you have layers that can be abraded off, that can be rubbed off. You're going to have in your mouth and your esophagus and down around your anus, you're going to have this stratified squamous because you're going to have food rubbing against and knocking the cells loose. So you have several layers. Stratified means several layers of flat cells from your mouth through your esophagus. Most of the rest of it's going to be columnar. So those are those tall, skinny cells. And in between the tall, skinny cells, you're going to have the goblet cells, again, usually secreting mucus. You have the lamina propria, which is loose connective tissue that kind of holds these cells in where they're supposed to be. This is important because your cells need to know where to divide. And if you have a cut and you cut through the lamina propria, if you cut through the connective tissue layer underneath, then a lot of times the cells don't know where to grow to replace where you're wounded. So if you cut deeply enough, you're going to actually have to have stitches. If you don't have stitches, then sometimes instead of growing the correct kind of cells, you'll just make a scar. So if you look inside your mouth, you probably have scars from where you've bitten your cheek, where you've bitten your tongue, and you cut so far and so deeply, the cells didn't know how to grow back correctly, so it put scar tissue instead of the correct kind of cells. Going back to when we talked about the immune system, we talked about mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT. And so this mucosal layer has a lot of lymphocytes and lymphatic nodules. So they're looking for something that came in with your food that shouldn't be there. So if you don't wash your vegetables really well, then you're going to be eating all kinds of little organisms. And that's okay. Your body can take care of most of them. Underneath the mucosal layer is your submucosa. And it's got more of that loose connective tissue that we were talking about. Also running through that loose connective tissue, you've got blood vessels, you've got lymphatic vessels, you have nerve plexuses. So this is where you have a bunch of axons, bundles of axons that are acting together in a little group. And then, of course, you have the mucus secreting glands that put mucus into the lumen. So the lumen is the hole in that where you're a tube, from your mouth to your anus, you're a tube. So the hole in the middle where the food is sliding through, and then later on the poop is sliding through, is called the lumen. So that's the opening. So the MALT is in the submucosa as well as in the mucosa. I'm not sure why they don't introduce the word peristalsis while they're talking about this, but the inner circular layer and the outer longitudinal layer of muscle are what are responsible for peristalsis, or the movement of food. Some places this inner circular layer is thicker, and where you have this thicker layer, you have more and more of the circular muscle. We're going to call those sphincters. And the PH sounds like an F, sphincter. So you have sphincters throughout your GI tract to stop the movement of food. So you have a sphincter at the bottom of your esophagus going into your stomach. And sometimes people have trouble opening up that sphincter, so food backs up in their throat. And then eventually that sphincter opens up and allows the food to drop down into the stomach. At the bottom of this slide, I've added a link to a YouTube. And you can pause and copy this down and go look at this. It is fantastic. They just run a camera down and show you the food as it moves through the GI tract. I'm just going to show you about a minute of it that I find fascinating. Here's an excerpt from that video that I highly recommend that you watch.
Waves of contracting muscle keep the food moving, a process called peristalsis. These contractions are so powerful, we can even eat upside down. For the first time, a new camera shows a high-definition view of how food travels through our bodies and into our stomachs. Food enters the stomach through a hole at the top. The stomach is a bag of muscle that churns, squashes, and squeezes food into liquid. At the same time, acids break the food down. The stomach walls protect themselves with a lining of mucus. Without it, the acids could digest parts of the stomach itself, causing stomach ulcers. About an hour later, the stomach squeezes the broken down food out through a tiny hole called the pyloric sphincter. The food enters the small intestine, an 11-foot coil of tube where we absorb most of the nutrients. The interior wall of the small intestine is lined with millions of microscopic projections called villi. These increase the surface area of the gut, making it easier to absorb nutrients. First, the pancreas pumps out a juice that neutralizes stomach acid. Then bile from the liver breaks down the smaller droplets are easier for the intestine to absorb. After an hour and a half, the small intestine has absorbed most of the nutrients from the food. It's time for what remains to move on. It enters the large intestine through this, the ileocecal sphincter, a valve that keeps our food from going back where it came from. What's left is a mix of waste food and dead cells from the walls of the gut. The large intestine's main job is to extract water from it. Lots of bacteria live here too, but it isn't because of an infection. We actually need them. They produce enzymes that break down complex carbohydrates in our food, carbohydrates we couldn't otherwise digest. Finally, after about 12 hours, we expel what's left of our first meal.
So we can look at really cool pictures like this, or you can actually watch the food enter the baby's mouth, and they have cameras all the way through the body, and you actually saw the food as it's processed all the way through and comes out the rectum. So I think that the moving picture is worth even more than this picture. But this is a nice summary. You saw all the folds, so you know that this can expand. Anytime you have folded up area, this is going to have a lot of surface area to absorb. You've got your muscular layer in the middle, and you've got on the inside, you remember that you have the mucosal layer, and on the outer you have the serosal layer. So here they're talking about the enteric nervous system. It's about 100 million neurons, and it doesn't need the central nervous system. It doesn't need the brain and the spinal cord. It can act independently. So this was a big surprise, and we've only just discovered this recently. The central nervous system can act on it, but it doesn't have to act. Sometimes when you have a bunch of neurons working together, we call it a plexus. And in this enteric nervous system that we just recently discovered, you have one plexus that is talking to the mucosal area and the submucosal area, and then you have one that's in the muscular area, the mesenteric plexus. And you've also got parasympathetic ganglia in this area, so that's where the nervous system comes in and can talk to the enteric nervous system, so they can interact. When I think of the mesenteries, I think of saran wrap or plastic wrap, whatever brand you buy, where you take things and you wrap them up in this clear membrane that holds moisture in and keeps things from making your food smell funny. So if you look inside your intestines, you actually have these mesenteries, and it looks like somebody's kind of saran wrapped your intestines in place. And this is kind of interesting because horses don't have the mesenteries holding their intestines in place. So if you run a horse and then you feed it right away after it's finished running, then its intestines can, as that food crawls through, like we saw the food crawling through in the baby, as the food crawls through, it can actually cause the intestines to flop over each other and actually bind so that you can't pass any food through. So our mesenteries hold our intestines so that doesn't happen in our bodies. But in horses, it can happen. And what they usually do, rather than do surgery and try to straighten the intestines out, is they usually just shoot the horse. So here it is in scientific terms. The mesenteries hold the abdominal viscera in proper relationship to each other. So that's a nicer way of saying that it keeps your intestines from twisting and getting all tangled up. And so just the contractions of the intestines themselves could cause them to flip over each other, or moving around. Bending, stretching, exercising could cause it to overlap. So luckily we have this mesentery to hold everything in place. The mesentery also has its own blood vessels and nerves that are coming through it and going into the digestive tract. And there are lymph nodes and lymphatic vessels. So where we used to just think the mesentery was just a sheet of connective tissue and it didn't have any function, we now give it its own status as an organ. Your abdominal cavity is lined with a serous membrane, not serous, but serous membrane. And it comes down and comes up and forms the posterior mesentery. So you can go and look at all of this information. I'm not going to be testing you over all of the different mesenteries and all the different folds and things like that. If you know that the mesentery kind of holds things in place, then I'm excited about that. If you know that it's got all sorts of blood vessels and lymphatics and nerves running through it, then that's great also. Now, I do want you to know about the omentum. The omentum kind of hangs down from the stomach, and it covers the small intestines like an apron. I think that's one of the best ways of putting it. They did a good job of it there. And then it comes back and folds back up, so it makes a pouch. Now, one of the things that I've always wondered, you fill this pouch up with fat. So when you see somebody who's really fat, if you were to go in and look at their omentum, they have packed it full of fat. And so my question is, why can't we go into the omentum and remove that fat? It seems like it would be fairly easy. You've just got a bag of fat to remove it. But I've never heard of any thing that's like that. I mean, there's liposuction where they go in and kind of dissolve fat and suck it out, but they don't usually talk about the omentum. So here's a diagram showing you the lesser omentum and then the greater omentum. But usually when people are talking about the omentum, they're talking about this apron-like structure right here. And it just fills up with fat. If you lift up the omentum like you're pulling up your apron, and then underneath it you can see the large intestines and the small intestines, and you can see the mesenteries in here, and see them attached to the small intestines. So they've kind of pulled the small intestines out so you can see the omentum there, or excuse me, the mesentery there underneath the omentum. The motility and the secretions that you do into the digestive tract are controlled by nerves, neurons, hormones, and paracrine mechanisms. So paracrine, if you remember that, is where you secrete some chemical and it acts nearby. Paracrine is nearby acting. So you have stretch reflexes, you have chemical reflexes, you have vagovagal reflexes, which are parasympathetic, that help you with your motility and your secretion. Now, you know that sometimes if you're frightened, like you have to give a speech in front of a large body of people or sing or perform in front of people, you have an attack of diarrhea. So the sympathetic comes in, takes over, and pushes everything out really quickly. A lot of people talk about having butterflies in their stomach. But remember, most people don't realize that their stomach is over on the left side. So where they feel the butterflies, they actually feel their intestines moving. Two of the hormones that affect the GI tract are gastrin and secretin. So you secrete secretin. The mouth is called the oral cavity, or some people call it the buccal cavity. This is where you put food in, obviously. You taste it to see if it tastes good, if it's spoiled, if it's something that you enjoy eating. You chew and you swallow. But of course, the other things you can do with your mouth are talk and breathe, if you're a mouth breather. You have cheeks, lips. The palate is the top or the roof of your mouth, and your tongue. I will tell you that I am an old woman, and I have been teaching anatomy for over 4 decades, and never in my life have I ever heard anybody call the posterior opening to the throat the fauces. Kind of looks like faucet. You turn the faucet on in the sink. The fauces. But anyway, if you're in a trivial contest and they want to know what the back opening to the throat is, you can say, oh, that's the fauces. Now, inside your mouth, you have keratin, which is what makes up your fingernails and your hair. So it is kind of a horny material. It makes up horns also. It's hard, so your gums need to be hard because you're constantly jamming food on top of the teeth and ramming it down into the gums, if you stop and think about it. And also the roof of your mouth has to be really tough because you're constantly rubbing food back and forth across it using your tongue. So those areas have to be keratinized. But the sides of your mouth, your cheeks, your lips, and then the soft palate, you have a hard palate and a soft palate, those are going to be non-keratinized. So if they do like a cheek swab to get some cells, to look at the cells under the microscope, or to do a DNA study, they're going to go into your cheek. They're going to rub and knock off a few cells off of your cheeks rather than up on the roof of your mouth. There are some structures here that I want you to know. Obviously, the uvula. This little thing can swing back and keep food from going up your nose and out your nose whenever you swallow. So it's really an important thing. And then when people talk about their tonsils, they don't realize they have several different tonsils, but the ones that they'll be referring to are what we call the palatine tonsils. So they're right here. And they can swell up so large that they can actually obstruct your airway. You can't swallow and you can't breathe through your mouth. So when you have strep throat, they go back and they try to wipe in this area to see. The other thing that's kind of cool about tonsils is you get what they call tonsil stones. They're not really stones, but because there's crypts, there's little holes or divots or dips in your tonsils, food can pack down in there and it makes a little hard, waxy thing. And every now and then they'll just pop out. They actually look like they've drawn a few of them right here. So if you want to gross yourself out, go on to Google and look up tonsil stones. And you'll see some people make a lot of them. And some people just make them every now and then. Everyone knows about your tongue, but underneath it you have the lingual frenulum. So this is the thing that holds your tongue down. Now, one of the things that I've heard over and over again is if somebody's having a seizure, put a stick in their mouth to keep them from swallowing their tongue. So put it sideways in their mouth, not down their throat, but stick it sideways from side to side, holding their tongue down. And I'm trying to figure out how you could possibly swallow your tongue because it's attached to the frenulum. About the only way that that could occur would be literally to just rip this whole area out. And that doesn't happen. So I'm thinking that that would be one of those myths, urban myths, but it persists. And then you have salivary glands, and they squirt out quite a bit of saliva. So you have sublingual and submandibular salivary ducts. And if you lift your tongue up and hold it up long enough, you can actually watch the saliva squirt out. So that's kind of fun. You do have a superior and an inferior frenulum, but they're really small. They're a lot smaller than this lingual frenulum. Occasionally, a child is born where this frenulum goes all the way to the tip of the tongue, and we say the child is tongue-tied, and so you actually have to snip some of the frenulum to release the front of the tongue. So you can go next time you're in the bathroom and lift your tongue up and look how far down your tongue the frenulum comes, and then how much you can stick out of your mouth. So some people, they can stick their tongue out and they can reach down and actually touch their chin, and other people can just barely get it past their lips. So we call them tongue-tied, and they usually just snip a little bit of it so that you can extend your tongue and otherwise you talk funny. You talk like this because you can't move your tongue. Here's a word we're going to use from time to time. It's the vestibule. So we talk about the vestibule in the ear, and now we're talking about the vestibule in your mouth. So if you were to put your finger in your mouth and put it between your gums and your lip down there, actually that's where a lot of people put their chew. If they dip tobacco, or they put their dip down there. So the vestibule is an entryway. So in most people's houses, you don't walk directly into a room, you walk into a little hallway, and we call that your vestibule. So it's just the entryway or the opening. So you use this several times in anatomy, and I want to just point that out. Not that I really care that you know that the space between your cheeks and your teeth is your vestibule, but whenever you see it, you go, oh, that's an entryway. That's just an opening to something. So when we did the muscular system, we talked about the circular muscle that makes up the area underneath the lips, and it allows us to make O shapes with our lips. Here's the Orbicularis oris. So it starts out orbit, O-R-B-I-T, Orbicularis, and it goes around. So that's kind of easy. You have another one that goes around your eyes, each of your eyes, and it's the Orbicularis oculi. I spent about a fourth of my life overseas with the Department of Defense, and I did 2 tours of duty through England. And one of the things that they are very emphatic about making sure that you understand is that if you have a grease fire, so everybody knows that the Brits love their fish and chips, if you have a pan of hot oil and it catches on fire, your first instinct is just throw water on it. So you run over to the sink, you grab some water, and you throw it on it. If you do that, if you throw water on a grease fire, it will blow that grease all over you. And so they have videos of people whose faces have been burnt off by hot oil. Now, one of the interesting things that came out of that, since I teach anatomy, I'm always interested in that sort of thing. If you burn your lips off, and they want to do a skin graft to replace the skin, most of the skin, like the cutaneous area, is colored like the rest of your face, but your lips are actually kind of reddish in color. So about the only place you're going to find any tissue that looks the same is the labia of your vagina. So it's kind of interesting after you've had the skin transplant that people are hesitant to kiss you because of where the tissue came from. And I always thought that that was interesting. So by the way, if you do have a grease fire, just put a lid over it. It'll go right out. Don't throw water on it. Most of the things that we call the taste buds on our tongue are actually papilla, or nipple-shaped bumps. On the ends of some of the papilla are our taste buds. So here's you a picture of a taste bud sticking out on one of those papilla. One of the labs that I've done with my students for many, many decades is mapping the areas of the taste buds. Which ones taste salt, which ones taste sweet, which ones taste bitter. And now if you look on Google or one of the search engines, it goes, no, that's not true. All the taste buds taste all the different tastes. And so that's just a myth that you can map different tastes, different areas of the tongue. So there you go. All those years we did those experiments, and now Google says that they were a waste of time. One of the interesting things with my second child was I had so much acid indigestion that it would back up into my mouth, and I lost my papilla and I lost my taste buds. So when you looked at my tongue, it was just as smooth as a baby's bottom. And I thought that was the weirdest thing. As soon as I had the baby, the taste buds all grew back, and I taste just fine. And since I haven't had COVID, I still can taste things. So they call the front part the anterior, 2/3 of the tongue is in the oral cavity, and then you have about 1/3 of the tongue that actually goes back down into your throat. And so they call the mouth throat area the oral pharynx. Most of you know about the oral pharynx because if you put your finger onto that part, if you go back to the root of the tongue, you'll throw up. So people who are bulimic, they start out putting their finger down their throat and vomiting because it reverses peristalsis. But after a while, they get so good at it, they just think about it and then they just throw up. They don't even have to put their finger down their throat. But when somebody is taking a swab to see if you have strep throat, a lot of times people gag or throw up. If you're going into speech therapy, then you should learn about the intrinsic muscles that are inside the tongue and the extrinsic muscles, which are outside the tongue. And you're welcome to learn the name of them. I'll not be testing you over that information. You should know that your lower jaw is your mandible and your upper jaw is your maxilla. And they're so hard for students to remember that because they both start with M and they both have to do with one, either the top or the bottom of your teeth. So mandible and maxilla, you need to get those straight in your mind so you don't get them mixed up. Now, it's kind of interesting. If you look at the different kinds of taste buds, if you look at the kind of papilla that you have on your tongue, then you have the fungiform, and they kind of look like mushrooms. So mushrooms are a fungus. I don't know if you know that, but there's your fungiform. Then you have your foliate, and then you have this division between the body of your tongue and the root of your tongue. You usually don't see the root of your tongue because it's going down your throat, but you have a different kind of papilla there. And of course, there's your palatine tonsils, which we call just your tonsils, but you also have lingual tonsils. Here's another word you're going to see several times. It's rugae, and it is a fold. So you have folds in your stomach, which are rugae. You have folds in the hard palate. So if you stick your tongue up to the roof of your mouth, you'll actually feel the hard palate. Or if you've seen anybody who has dentures and they pop out their upper dentures, that part that holds all the teeth in would be the hard palate for someone who no longer has teeth. Sometimes you see a child and they have a scar that extends from their nose down to their lip. This child was probably born with a cleft palate. It is a really common birth defect. This is what it looks like. Where the roof of the mouth doesn't close, the two halves don't come together. And so you have a cleft palate or a split palate. The soft palate is behind the hard palate. So as you're getting ready to go into the oral pharynx, then you're going to pass from the hard roof of your mouth to a softer area, and your uvula hangs down from there. The word for your teeth is dentition, and you can kind of remember that because you go to the dentist to have him look at your teeth. So dentition kind of makes sense. There's that word masticate that they left off of the earlier slide. So that means simply to chew. That's just the fancy word for chewing. So if you don't chew some things, for example, peanuts or corn, when you see it come out in the fecal material, when you poop it out, you're going to see the whole peanut. Because if you don't chew it up, you can't break it down and you can't absorb it in the small intestine. So it'll pass out pretty much like it went in. Same thing with corn. Most of us just bite off big chunks of it, chew it just a little bit and swallow. But unless you pop each of those little kernels of corn and get the inside out, then you're not going to get any nutritive value from it. You're not going to get any food from it because it's going to pass right out looking exactly like it went in. So mastication is important. most people have 32 adult teeth. And I'm sure everyone knows that you start out with a set of teeth called baby teeth, and you lose your baby teeth, and then the other set that you have above that in your jaws will descend down and fill up where the baby teeth were. And if you lose one of those teeth, then you're going to have a tooth implant or wear a bridge or have false teeth. Now, one of the interesting things, evolutionarily, we don't need to chew. We don't need our wisdom teeth, and our jaws tend not to be big enough to hold the wisdom teeth. So it's kind of a rite of passage for kids who are 17, 18, 19 years old to have their wisdom teeth cut out because there isn't any room in their mouth for them. And now we're finding children who are being born without wisdom teeth. So we're actually kind of watching a little bit of evolution in process here. If you've looked in the mouth of rabbits or hamsters, gerbils, mice, rats, you see incisor teeth. So we have incisor teeth also. So those are chisel-like teeth that you use to bite your food. And then on either side of those, you have canines. And they are pointed. So if you believe in vampires and stuff like that, it is your canines that are hollow and allow them to bite you and suck your blood. But if you look at a dog, you can really see the canine teeth. Ours aren't nearly as pronounced as a dog's, but we do have a pointed tooth on either side of our incisors. Then we have premolars and molars, and these are characterized by having a flat or slightly concave surface. And this is unfortunately where we grind away a lot of the enamel from our eating, or we get food and we leave it there and it dissolves away the enamel. But this is one of the main places you're going to get cavities. The socket where your tooth fits down in is called the alveolus, and the joint that's made where the tooth and the bone are held together is called a gum phosis, and it is called one of the fixed joints. So you don't want it to move. A lot of your joints, like your elbows and your upper arm, things like that, you want those joints to move. But a gum phosis is a fixed joint. So you have very little movement. If you feel movement of the tooth, then you're probably not getting enough calcium in your diet and you're actually dissolving away the bone. And so the alveolus or the tooth socket gets so large that the tooth is loose within the socket. So that's a danger sign. And a lot of times women, when they're pregnant, if they don't take supplements, if they don't drink a lot of milk, if they're not really careful to make sure there's plenty of calcium, the baby will send out hormones to dissolve the mother's bones. And so it's not at all uncommon for women who get pregnant to lose their teeth. And you actually have little ligaments that hold the tooth to the bone. So bone to bone is called a ligament. Even though the teeth aren't considered to be bones, they still call it a ligament because the other word would be tendon, and that would hold a muscle to a bone. So that one wouldn't work. So technically it's not a ligament because it's not holding bone to bone, but they still call it a ligament. You know the name of your gums, I hope, is gingiva, because you probably heard if you don't brush your teeth or if you get an infection in your gums, it's called gingivitis. So unless you have been raised on in a place where they don't have TV or commercials, then you've heard of gingiva or gingivitis. So they're always talking about if you use our toothpaste, it will relieve gingivitis. You don't have to memorize this, but it's interesting. It shows you baby teeth, and they're called deciduous. So if you've had a botany course, you know that deciduous trees are the ones that lose their leaves. So they call the baby teeth deciduous teeth because the baby is going to lose them as the permanent teeth grow in. Kind of shows when to expect the first teeth, 6 to 9 months. The next teeth, 7 to 11 months. And then they don't even get those back chewing teeth until almost 2 years old. If you look at the top of the molars, you see why it's so easy to get cavities, because food gets caught in those crevices. The top part of your tooth is called a crown, and a lot of people, as you get older, if they can't put a filling in, they'll actually put a crown. They'll replace the crown of the tooth. And it's rather expensive, but it's nice to have a crown because then you don't have to worry about your fillings and stuff like that. Below the crown, where you go just below the gums, that's called the root. And unfortunately, if you get an infection in your tooth, sometimes they'll go in and do what they call a root canal, and they'll drill down all the way through, down into the root, and kill the nerves in there. And as they're doing it, it is amazingly painful. So it's hard to put that area to sleep so that you can do drilling, because you're actually drilling in the nerves that are running up through this teeny tiny hole in the bottom of your tooth. So if you've never had a root canal, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you've had one, you're sitting there nodding, going, oh, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. And the gingival sulcus. So when we study the brain, we talk about the gyri that stick up and the sulcus, which are the dips or the little grooves in the brain. So you have a sulcus in your mouth, and that's between the tooth and the gum. Now, used to, whenever I would go in and have my teeth cleaned, one of the things they would do, they had this little sharp probe, and they would jab it between my tooth and gums and see how deep they could get it before they drew blood. And I hated that part of the dental exam. And lately, I don't know whether they've stopped doing it or whether I've gotten a kinder, gentler dental hygienist, but they don't do that anymore. They don't jab that thing down to see how far down they can stick it between the tooth and the gums. So you want to have a little pocket between the tooth and the gums, but not very deep. And as you get older, or if you get tooth decay, if you get gingivitis, then the gums will pull away from the teeth. And so this root area will be exposed. And so it's easier to get a cavity if the root area is exposed because the gums are pulled back. Another thing that was kind of interesting is they said if you have gingivitis, if you have an infection in your gums, it can spread to your heart. And then you'll have an infection of your heart, and it can be fatal. So they say tend to your gums. And if they're inflamed and infected, make sure you find out why they are and fix it before the bacteria spread. And that always seems so odd to me. But unfortunately, the bacteria that like to grow in this area also like to grow on the flaps of your heart. So we're going to look at the words of the parts of the tooth, and then we'll look at an actual picture and we'll point it out again. But the enamel is the hard outer covering over the top of the tooth, and you cannot regrow it. You can't put it back on. Once you've worn it away or bacteria have dissolved it, you can't put it back. Underneath that is dentin, and you actually can regrow some dentin. And then What an odd word. The name of the covering over the root is cement. So there you go. So the cement and the dentin can regenerate, but the enamel cannot. Now, as you go down into the roots of the tooth, you have a pulp cavity. And in that pulp cavity, that's where you have those nerves and blood vessels. So let's look at that. At the very end, at the very bottom of the tooth, there's a little hole that lets things in and out. So when you see the word foramen, it's an opening. So when you do the skull, you talk about the magnum foramen, which is where the spinal cord attaches to the brain, and you have to have a hole in the skull to allow it through. So the word foramen means hole. And one word that they just kind of threw in here is occlusion. So one of the things that dentists will test you for is, do your teeth meet the way they should? So some people have an overbite and their upper teeth hang out over their teeth. Some people have an underbite and they kind of look like a bulldog because their lower jaw seems to be jutted out and their teeth on the bottom stick out. So you've probably seen people with overbites and underbites. But if you have proper occlusion, your teeth meet correctly so you can grind up your food. So here's the promised picture. Here's the crown up here. There's the gums. There's the root. And if you look, there's the enamel right there. There's the dentin. And this is the pulp, this region right here. So if you get an infection in your tooth, they'll drill down and destroy the pulp. They'll destroy all the way down, all the way down, all the way down. And that's a root canal. And then they'll replace it with melted rubber. So it smells really gross when they put that melted rubber in there. Remember that the name for gums is gingiva. And here's where the tooth comes down. And that's where they test to see how deep the sulcus is. Right there, by poking down in that area. And this outer covering on the outside of the root part is called cement. Remember that? And there's the little opening at the bottom that allows the blood vessels and the nerves to go up into the tooth. So if you're going to do drilling on a tooth, you've got to numb this nerve right there that's going to go up into the tooth. And I didn't realize this, but sometimes if the dentist is going to do work on more than one tooth, instead of trying to deaden this, they'll go to the intersection of your maxilla and mandible and deaden that area. So they're trying to deaden the nerves that are coming into the whole side of your face there. This is a skull of someone who has baby teeth and then permanent teeth that haven't erupted. They haven't pushed through and come down. So that's kind of interesting to see two sets of teeth, the ones that have erupted and the ones that are still in the jawbone. Right there. The other thing that really surprises people is the maxilla is this part right here. And the mandible is huge. Look how big it is. It doesn't stop here like the maxilla does. It comes all the way up and intersects and joins with the skull, hinges with the skull. So it's a lot larger. Wisdom teeth, if they can't come through, are said to be impacted. So a lot of times a student will tell me, oh, I'll have to go have my wisdom teeth out because they're impacted. So they actually have to cut them out of the jawbone. When you're in middle school, and you discover that there's an opposite sex, one of the things that you do is you sit around and you talk about what it would be like to kiss someone. And of course, at that point in time, you're like, ew, yuck, and you call it swapping slobbers. Well, that's actually kind of one of the things that you do. When you kiss someone, you're sharing up to 700 different kinds of microorganisms. A lot of those are bacteria, some are viruses, some are fungus. So that's just normal. Brushing your teeth will lessen the amount of them, but you're not going to get rid of them. They're with you. They're down in your sulcus. They're all over the place. They're on your tongue. You have Manila yeast growing on your tongue. So as these bacteria divide, a lot of them make a kind of a sticky substance so that they can stick onto your teeth. And unfortunately, this sticky substance has a lot of acid that will actually dissolve your enamel and dissolve all the way into your dentin, causing you to have a cavity. The proper name for a cavity is a dental carie. A dental carie. So you and I call it cavities, but the dentist will call it, you have several dental caries that we need to fill. If that cavity manages to make it to the pulp, then you're going to have to destroy that area because the bacteria will thrive in there. And not only will they thrive, but they'll be able to go through that foramen and get into your jawbone and dissolve away your jawbone. So I used to have some pictures, I cannot find them, where someone had an infected tooth and it ate away the jawbone. So the dentist took some amazing pictures of the hole inside of the bone, and I've not been able to find them. So, but I'm sure if you Google it, you could find some pictures. If you have a sticky residue on your teeth, and you can actually take your fingernail and scratch some of it off, that's called plaque. So you can usually brush away the plaque by brushing your teeth every morning and every evening. If this is allowed to stay on the teeth for any period of time, then it becomes hardened or rock-like, and so we call it calculus. And it is plaque that has calcium added to it. And you can feel it raised up off of your teeth. So in this case, you're going to have to go to the dentist, and they have special scrapers that they can scrape the calculus off of your teeth. So I just said if you got an infected tooth, the bacteria could get up into the bone and dissolve away the socket, the alveolus, the actual jawbone. So here's the fancy way of saying it. Periodontal disease is the destruction of the supporting bone around the teeth, which may result in tooth loss. One of the things about calculus, if you don't take care of it, if you don't let the dentist scrape it off or the dental hygienist scrape it off, is it will actually get down in the sulcus and push the tooth and the gum apart. And of course, if anytime you push the gums away from the teeth, then you're allowing the root to be exposed to bacteria, and they'll just start dissolving away the cement and get down into the root. So you don't want to leave calculus on your teeth. Good dental hygiene is important. If you're going to be a dental hygienist or a speech therapist, then you probably want to memorize this slide. This just tells you which muscles do what. The tongue, the buccinator, the orbicularis oris, the masseter temporalis, all of these are the ones that allow side-to-side grinding, raising and lowering your teeth, and so on. I'm going to stop here and resume talking about saliva, which you and I call spit, in part 2 of digestion.